Welcome to Andrew Talks with your host, Andrew.
Hello, and welcome back to another Andrew Talks. Today, I have James Alexander, the co-founder and CEO of Loop Horizon on. James, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, before we get started, would you like to do a introduction to the audience, a little bit about who you are?
Sure. So my background, most relevant bits are I worked for a long time at Sky, and one of the projects I was asked to sort of start up and create was called a decisioning program. Terrible brand name, but what it was at its essence was the use of Sky's customer data to connect that into all the customer touch points, the website, the call center in particular, and use that customer data to give customers more relevant experience and also to drive business commercial benefit for Sky in doing so. We did that to fantastic success, and off the back of that, combined with Comcast taking over Sky, it created an opportunity to create Loop Horizon, which we did back in 2019. And everything's just built from there, really. So now we're a multi-million pound business, fastest growing FT1000 list for the last 2 years. And we're really finding our feet with a fantastic range of clients and increasing experience in how effective we are in helping them achieve their objectives around data-driven transformation.
And that's where we first met back at Sky. So, I was part of your wider team in the digital analytics area, and when we were brought over, kind of moved away from doing the digital analytics implementation and started looking at the subject matter expert and how do we actually connect the different data sets and make sure that we have the customer data flowing through into Adobe Target. So it's great to finally reconnect with you, even though I now have been part of Blue Horizon for about 3 years.
Absolutely. No, it's fantastic to have you as part of the team. And I still very fondly look back at our time at Sky, and so much of what we did back then is still incredibly relevant in terms of how Loop helps its clients. You know, we learned an awful lot. We were pioneering, might not have felt like it at the time, but I think now that we've seen lots of other businesses, we really were pushing the edges. And as you said, you know, so often the digital data is absolutely central to that, both in understanding what customers are doing and the addressability of digital data, and also the flip side, if I know who the customer is, because I'm doing that so that I have more addressable, actionable data. That typically also means that I can go in the reverse direction, and suddenly the digital experience is something that I can start to influence using various pieces of technology and intelligence, you know, likely brought in from a much wider set of data sources than just digital.
Yes, it's very important to be able to do the reverse lookup and figuring out how do you understand the client more, understand the website, and then be able to deliver them a relevant experience for their customers.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to bring you on because you wrote an article on the Horizon, which I'm going to link onto this podcast, called Maximizing Your Investment, the Missing Use Cases. And just a little bit of a behind the scenes, you were talking about this also in one of our quarterly business reviews. And I just wrote down immediately, I would love to have you on to talk about this.
No, my pleasure. It's a great topic and something that is central to what we do at Loop Horizon because so often it's at the core.
100% agree. So I'm just going to lead into some questions, give you opportunity to talk about it, and feel free if you want to talk about something which I don't actually bring up. So
Absolutely.
in your article, The Missing Use Case, you mentioned that many organizations miss out on significant return on investment by overlooking certain use cases. Why do you think these missing use cases are so commonly neglected? And what's the cost of that oversight?
So, in the article, I talk about four types of use case when it comes to assessing a broader transformation. You know, sort of material technology change. So they break down, or what we identify from our work with clients is they tend to break down into two types of what we would call pretty standard use cases. So this is where, you know, especially if it's coming from the marketing teams as an example, it's addressing known gaps. So these are things that are a constant frustration to the marketeers. They want it, sort of fixed, basically. It's not particularly, advanced, but they've got a high degree of confidence in terms of this will make a difference. So they're very powerful for helping convince people to get behind the transformation business case. And the second is around improving existing activities. So this is where I'm doing something, but I know that if I was able to do it in a slightly better way, maybe that's using data to have slightly more differentiation. If I'm sending out an email, or my typical email is going out to everybody, but I know there are some differences in my customers, and so actually, even using very basic segmentation, I can talk to those customers in a different way and get them to engage more with email, or it might be web, or it might be, there's lots of different sort of marketing channels. Those are what we sort of, they're very typical, very standard. Nearly every set of every business case will include use cases in that sort of image. Where we start to see sort of differences in terms of how much effort and how robust the use case definition is in the next two, which is particularly the advanced use case. So sort of doing something completely new. So often, because it's not sort of day to day familiar with the delivery teams, these tend to be a bit more theoretical. This should be something we should be able to do. This is something I want to be able to do. I don't quite know how I'm going to do it. Maybe the technology vendor, if involved, has sort of expressed confidence that this is absolutely possible, but it's not necessarily something that they sort of project the same level of confidence against. And so the business case, or the value from that use case is often high, but it's sort of marked almost with an asterisk in terms of much lower confidence. And then there's a fourth sort of use case, which is a really important one, and one that we very rarely see sort of identified up front through internal teams, which is so often the rebuild of the capabilities, particularly if it's sort of transformation scale, will unlock a broader sort of general process improvement. And that might be, just being able to be able to do more. It might be sort of almost team mentality in terms of, well, now I can actually start thinking and sort of change how I feel. And it's really intangible that is often so important in terms of, you know, that benefit that you just get a general uplift in all aspects of sort of performance of the marketing team. And sorry, I keep on using marketing as the primary sort of example here, but they tend to be the majority of times the team who are actually responsible for delivering the benefit.
No, I agree. The marketing team is always one of those that really like to push the boundaries, and they're the ones who would normally go out there and investigate what new tools could they be using to actually deliver that a little bit of advantage in the
Yeah.
industry.
I think that's absolutely right. But one of the challenges the marketing team is they don't have the sort of technical feasibility considerations, right? So you can have a very attractive piece of sort of vendorware or brochureware that sort of says, I can do this, and what they don't necessarily have is that sort of robust understanding of how much of this is sort of BS. How difficult is it? How well does it fit in the wider technology ecosystem? And what you've just described there is something hopefully we'll talk about in a bit in terms of the differences between the marketing team and the technology team and how you get them to work together.
I do believe that's gonna be one of the questions, but I mean, with one of our clients that we worked with in the past, there was a marketing team that was trying to bring in a new technology, and they asked to deploy essentially a pixel on. And when you think about pixel, you don't think of it as being much. But I was asked to actually look into it and dig into what is it going to actually do on the website. And actually dig into it, you realize this is not just a pixel. This is almost like a tag management solution being deployed on. And I go back and I asked them about, well, why do you have these event listeners on? Or you mentioned there's only one cookie, but just look at this. I could at least see 8 cookies being dropped, some of these
Yeah.
being dynamic.
Yeah.
and they all the marketing team saw was what benefit this could bring, but it's looking at that technical know-how of what is it actually doing, and is it actually going to help your website? Because if you're slowing down your website, you're actually gonna be hurting in the long run.
No, no, completely, that is a specific danger of a very narrow use case or a very narrow requirement, but being delivered by something which is way broader, right? And that's a great example of exactly the type of things that we sort of stumble across, and why you need that wider perspective to understand how it all connects together.
Agree. Now, you mentioned out of the 4 types of use cases, the last 2, the advanced and rare ones, often bring the most valuable, yet hardest to identify. Can you share an example where uncovering one of these led to a breakthrough for one of our clients?
Yes. So we had a travel operator client, and they had new data, a single customer view that was hooked up and available, and the expectation was that they would start, sort of using it in anger, and they did, very well through the standard things. So it enabled them to unlock a little bit of sort of new general improvement to their sort of day-to-day activities. But one of the areas that they were keen to do, but just didn't really have the confidence to be able to get into, was the ambition to sort of rebuild journeys entirely. So sort of, now that they had a sort of coordinated view of their customers, we could start to do far better sort of multi-step, multi-channel journey planning. And what we did with them, is we identified a feasible use case that was heavily sort of, there was a known opportunity to improve, but we did it, sort of with a future facing approach in mind. So to sort of build this coordinated multi-step, multi-channel journey, lots of different legs in terms of how it would all come together. And it worked really well. And that was, something that they weren't confident enough in, but it gave them the confidence. And so then we agreed we'd pick the next two of these journeys that we wanted to build out. And so, increasingly we supported them lots in the first one. We sort of almost ran it end to end. In the second one, we did the design, and but they did a little bit more of the build. And then the third time, it was more that they led it, but with our sort of wraparound supervision and support. And then now we're into this phase where actually they're able to go and run and build and roll these journeys out more and more and more, and they're doing it on their own. And that's just a fantastic example of how, they just need a little bit of confidence to do this sort of much more pioneering, much more sophisticated, albeit it isn't massively more sophisticated, it's just more complicated. And now they're able to manage that and drive it and optimize it themselves. And that's an incredible sort of story and sort of example of what we try and achieve all the time.
I love the fact that you brought up about giving them the confidence to be able to do this going forward, because sometimes you just need to give someone a helping hand to get them going. And once they can get going, they realize, we don't need those training wheels anymore. We can run this on our own, but still come back for any guidance.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, I think that really talks about how much often the technology isn't really the thing holding them back. It's the confidence and understanding the processes to be able to take advantage of that technology, rather than has the technology been set up in the right place in the first place.
Agreed. Now, while we find that the most value is in these rare and advanced ones, couldn't chasing one of these lead to diminishing returns or higher execution risk and wasted resources that could be better spent on core improvements?
It's definitely a sensible call out, something to be aware of. Something we would we would guide not to necessarily start there, if that makes sense. I think you want to build some good early momentum. So being able to focus on some pretty low hanging fruit is a good way to approach that, rather than trying to jump into something really complicated. I think the key thing is it's about building the transformation or the change in a way which doesn't close off those longer term ambitions, that almost setting the mindset out, even if you don't start with them, that your intention is to get there. You have a commitment, you have an expectation from the senior executive that you will get there. But everyone's understanding that actually we don't just want to jump straight into those, high execution risk, complicated solutions. So it's about building up that level of confidence, and that's sort of bespoke to every organization. It's very difficult to know. There's no standard sort of readiness. It depends on the teams, on how much you're changing a process, or how much the technology is changing as well. There's a lot of variables at play there, but absolutely, I think you're right. You don't want to sort of chase after the more advanced activities straight away, but equally, you've got to leave yourself open, and there needs to be that expectation that the teams will go forwards into that sort of space.
Absolutely. It's almost like boxing. You want to go in, you want to start off with the jab. You don't want to go in with the knockout punch. So you have to start off smaller. You got to build up that momentum, and then you can build up to that knockout punch.
Absolutely, I love that.
But I also think back to Sky. The Digitalix team, we bounced around between the multiple directors, and one of your former colleagues, Chris Bernard, I loved one of his sayings where he said that you should always shoot for the stars because even if you miss, at least you landed on the moon. So you have to have that inspiration or aspiration that you want to go for some of these rare use cases. But before you get there, you have to start building up so you can get to the stars.
I think that's spot on. Yeah, there's not much point in sort of if everyone's solely focused on just fixing the basics and with no intention to go beyond that, then it becomes a fait accompli, and you sort of almost guaranteeing you will never get there.
Agreed. Now, you talk about the importance of bridging the gap between marketing and technology teams. What are some of the effective strategies or tools you've seen work well to foster that collaboration?
Yes, look, this is often the crux of success or failure. My number one recommendation is to hire Loop Horizon. We act as an experience guide and can translate between the functions. But in all seriousness, the translation is the key. It's not just different languages; it's actually translating between different mindsets, different philosophies. A little bit stereotypical, but trading and marketing are much more likely to be you know, high skewed towards short term. They don't want to wait for capability to build before they can start using it. They want something they can get going with to show progress. They will be massively, massively risk averse with good reason because their jobs are on the line, sort of ultimately, regarding anything impacting sort of underlying trading performance. So, very important to sort of protect the downside there, but maximize the openness to upside. And they're often very open to taking tactical shortcuts because it delivers value quicker, and that's the sort of the really important thing for them. And you look at the flip side, and technology have, they tend to take a longer term time frame. Typically, fall into one of two camps, which is either be really pioneering or be sort of super safe. They'll tend to hate shortcuts and rarely anywhere near as commercially minded as the marketing or trading teams are. So I think that in a nutshell, being able to lead the line between those two is so important, and we use a framework which sort of tries to tease this out. PVA is the acronym we use internally. But you need to understand and get that trade-off right between being pioneering in the sort of, in the top circle. You've got business value in the second circle, and then you've got a third circle, which is achievability or feasibility. And you need to understand all of your plans and activities. That's technical plans, that's operational plans, that's sort of your use cases across all three of those aspects. And typically the sweet spot is right in the middle of those three circles where they overlap, and finding that sweet spot is if you can find it, you'll be on a very good path to success because it'll allow you to engage and work with both teams on a sort of common understanding and a common purpose.
I do wonder if some of the reasons that there are this gap between marketing and technology isn't so much down to the mindset of that marketers are willing to take shortcuts and the technology team are really risk averse on that, but just because their KPIs are set differently, where marketing is all around how much sales can you get in, while the technology team is more around how do we ensure that the site is up and that
Yeah.
so the uptime is always there.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think they are just functions which have different objectives, and it's not super straightforward to make those objectives find the gap where they overlap, and you can sort of operate aligned. I think it's always there's always a trade-off at some level. Nearly every engagement we've ever done at Loop Horizon, and certainly back at Sky, we've had a point where we've had to do something a little bit suboptimal from a technology perspective to deliver on a particular use case because it was required for trading or sort of other reason beyond the program, potentially. But equally, we've also sort of gone the other way and limited some of the immediate gains because it was sort of gonna cause, sort of deliver value in this quarter, but it's going to set us back 6 months because we're gonna have to rebuild something, at which point it's a strong pushback. And the key thing is that transparency and, recognition that as long as everybody understands and buys into why the decisions are happening, even though it may not be your call, if you've got that understanding, then actually it's far easier to get behind that decision, and make sure that there isn't any residual frustration between the two teams.
And I think that buy-in is the most important one because I remember at Sky, we always said that we were a telecommunication company that had delivering of new technology. But if you ask anyone in the technology team, it's that they're a technology company that happens to be a telecommunication company. So it's just a different little mindset of how you looked at it.
Absolutely. No, no, quite and radical impact in terms of how you then approach different projects, right?
Agreed. So how can companies ensure they're not just solving today's problems, but also building capabilities for future, less obvious opportunities?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is this is a golden question, right? That's like really tricky to confidently deliver on. The approach we take to that is to look at it from both a short-term basis, and a long-term basis. And so, across both technology and the marketing team, if I just use those two as an example, in your short-term plan, you'll want high delivery confidence, really clear on what we're gonna do, it's gonna work. But equally, there's a trade-off there. There's little or no flexibility to how you do it. And then you contrast that with the long-term plan, where you're gonna have, in reality, an awful lot of flexibility because nobody will definitively know this is gonna be the biggest area of value or this is gonna work the best. And I think on that basis, you'll have a longer term plan and you have a shorter term plan. And what you really need to understand is, well, look, how is my short term activity going to be able to traverse the gap between, do I know how and what I'm going to do to get from, my short term plan and how it's going to build into something in the longer term, which delivers towards those sort of big picture goals and opportunities that I'm going after.
And I think that's probably one of the points that a lot of companies don't really take into account, or at least not brought down far enough, where having that vision of where are we going to be in 3 to 5 years.
I think that's exactly right, and actually that's how I would sort of, well, it's not the only way I'd but in terms of, like, defining, if you're trying to work out how am I gonna go about my transformation, I think it's so important that you have both perspectives really well established. Normally it's quite easy and quick to sort of work out the short-term plan, but you need to combine that with the high level technology solution agnostic view, if you want to, if that makes sense. So sort of don't bind yourself to particular vendors. Just try and understand what are you trying to do, where are you trying to get to, and then you can start working back between the two and understand: is there anything I need to do? When do I need to do it? When does it need to be in place so that I can actually build up And really important that when you're thinking about that sort of short term and long term plan, you're not just think about it from a technical perspective. It's the operational feasibility, the time it takes for operational activity to sort of grow and become the business as usual activity. That takes a long time. The resource, like in terms of effort, we normally say, the resource on the marketing teams or the impact is often at least the same as it is on the technology teams in terms of change, and making sure that you've sort of factored that into your plans is really, really important. Have you got the right, well, training or sort of clarity of how processes are going to change? Have you got the right skill sets within the organization? Have you maybe got the right organization structure to be able to take this on going forwards? Because, again, a lot of what well, the work that we're in, which is sort of, enabling data-driven marketing at scale, what that really means is you need to change your not necessarily organizational ownership, but certainly the operating model. It needs to be far more collaborative because all of a sudden marketing is contingent on how well data is doing, how well data scientists are doing, the analysts, the technology teams. So many things are required for coherent, coordinated end-to-end delivery from, all the way back from collecting the right data in Google Tag Manager or Adobe Launch through to, being able to send out a highly targeted specific email or paid media advert. All of those steps in the middle need to be well established and sort of understood so that they can be managed in a coherent way.
Additionally, I think it's also about making sure that you have the right people and the right amount of resource to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Because I know some companies, they'll get the tools, but they forget the fact that they need to factor in the cost of the people to deliver it. So
Yeah.
it doesn't matter how much
No.
you spend on the tools. If you don't have anybody to use them, they're just laying there
Com
doing nothing.
Completely. I hate to say it, the tool is almost the least important aspect of the whole thing. There's there's very there are unique capabilities obviously within tools, but by and large, you can do most things with most tools. The key is that you've got that well understood sort of operating process, and you've got the right resource levels in place. It's not just the build of the capability either, it's the operational capacity to go and make it happen at scale in terms of in actual practice.
Yeah, I agree with the tools is literally the least important because let's be honest. If I bought a 10,000-pound golf set and went to go play around golf, what I could do with those golf club sets versus what you could do with them is completely different.
Indeed, thank you. But yeah, it's a good example, and yet, it doesn't matter whether it's it doesn't matter much whether it's 100 quid version of golf clubs or £1,000 set. They're better and they're going to help me do better, but broadly speaking, and there's almost no difference between the top tier golf clubs in terms they all broadly do the same thing, have the same technologies, they just have slightly different look and feel.
Yeah, it's about the experience of the person who's leveraging those tools.
Exactly, exactly. There's a really good example here, which is, we deliberately said no to a piece of work which was about putting in a digital asset management solution, and the reason was because they hadn't hired the VP of content, and I knew that there was no point because all capabilities are broadly the same. It comes down to how the VP of content wants to set up the operational processes of their team, and that is far more important than trying to understand, which digital asset management solution is marginally better than the other one in a particular aspect.
And I think that also takes into account of the short-term benefits to Loop Horizon versus the long-term impact of the reputation
Absolutely.
that could have had.
A Absolutely. Yes. No, we try and eat our own dog food here in terms of, we make decisions for long term, but also, recognizing the need to have short-term flexibility to support. And it's not just our plans, it's doing the right thing for clients always, right? And that's sort of, that's our core belief ultimately.
Yep, and that food does taste delicious. So, if a company is just starting to define their use cases for a new tech investment, what's one piece of advice you'd give them to avoid the common pitfalls you've seen?
Uh, so a specific piece of advice, we've talked about a lot of this already in terms of needing the long term, the short term view, the delivery feasibility, the operational feasibility. The one piece which always causes me a little bit of frustration is when use cases are viewed on their own. Because use cases from marketing absolutely are independent and they often sort of they deliver benefit sort of directly, but from a delivery capability, normally effectively, if you think of use cases, they're the verticals, and and the technical capabilities often work more on horizontals. And what you will find, or there's very likely to find, is actually if you start looking at the common capabilities that use cases use, well, you might as well almost aggregate them, at least when you're looking at it from a prioritization perspective, or sort of, in feasibility perspective. You can look at them all in aggregate and you'll get a far more powerful sort of view of the world, because there'll be a tendency from sort of legacy delivery approaches. We've seen this lots of times where it's sort of like you got to pick your favorite use case, and that's what we're going to do first. But in actual fact, from a technical delivery perspective, I might be able to do one or two things, and that might unlock five use cases, and those five use cases might well be manageable by the marketing team to actually bring to reality. At which point, you're suddenly left with a view that says, "Well, my investment case isn't built on just doing one or two of these sort of capabilities. Actually, I need to use all of these five use cases." The counter to that is when you get two standout use cases, but they actually use almost completely separate technical capabilities. There's very little overlap, and then but equally, by picking those first two, you've committed the business to basically delivering the entire technical side of the program. And that may not be the optimal way forwards either. Again, it depends on the specific situation, but you may want to take more of a phased approach, or sort of, so you need to be thinking about use cases in aggregate rather than just sort of individual use case by use case.
That is a really great tip there because if you do fully commit yourself, then you leave yourself with the opportunity to not turn around and think, well, are we on the right path?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Diversifies your delivery, your value,
Mhm.
risk as well. Because if I've got more use
Mhm.
cases, it's more likely I'm gonna find at least one or two of the five will sort of, work at least reasonably well, and that may well be enough to sort of make sure that the program is seen as a success, even if that primary use case didn't work quite as was expected.
And with me, I would always talk about just working backwards. So there is a book that I read called Working Backwards, looking at how does Amazon work. And they always start off whenever they're introducing a new product. They start off with the FAQs. So what are they trying to solve? And then they start working back to figure out what is the journey that they need to take to get to there.
Yep. Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of that. Actually, for a slightly different reason. But one of the things I think it does really, really strongly, particularly when you write it in customer language or customer benefit language, is it forces product teams or technology teams to actually be able to sort of they're forced to translate their way of thinking. They are at least documenting how they think it's going to support the marketing team or whatever it might happen. I'm never cease to be surprised at how much you get a product team that can get very focused on what they think is a great product, but they've just forgotten that it actually needs to be put together and positioned and used by people who aren't technologists, who don't understand what they've put together. And it just doesn't resonate in the same way that they sort of expect, because ultimately the customer and the marketeers are not technologists. So it needs to have that translation layer in terms of the impact. Will it actually work in real world?
Yeah. It doesn't matter if it works in a vacuum. It has to work in the wider ecosystem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No.
Now, I did put this down for about 1 hour, and I know we still have a little bit of time, but I just want to go ahead and respect the fact that you are very busy, James. So, I just want to do a wrap up and just any final thoughts on the discussion or anything that you want to leave the listeners as a key takeaway from. the missing use cases?
Well, look, a key takeaway would be go speak to Andrew. He's always a fount of information, and even just as a person to just soundboard ideas, or somebody different, sort of not directly involved in something. And that I think is probably what I would encourage people to talk outside of a closed group who are all super familiar. Test it with people who aren't super familiar in terms of what you're doing. If you can explain it so that it makes sense to them in terms of what you're planning to do, how it all fits together, where you're confident, where it's going to make a difference, then I think you are onto a very strong place in terms of, you should be confident that what you're planning to do is going to work. If, however, you stumble into that conversation and are really struggling to get them to understand, be clear in terms of why it matters or what's going to change and why it's going to be brilliant, then I think that is an important signal that you actually need to go back a little bit and take a step back and just sort of, not necessarily question whether you've got it right. It's just about how you're able to communicate it in a really clear, simple way that other people understand. And if you can crack that nut, then I think success is way more likely.
Thank you, James, and thank you for the flowering comments about
No, no.
myself.
Well,
I will
richly
say if you
deserved.
do want to sound about I was gonna say if you want to soundboard off of me, either just corner me or at least put it in my calendar because let's be honest, if it's not in my calendar, it doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
James, thank you so much for taking time out to discuss this. It's been absolutely a pleasure having you on. And anytime that you want to come back and talk about anything, please. I look at I have this podcast solution for my own benefit, but I also want to use it as a benefit for Loop Horizon. So anything that we could do to help Loop grow, I'm right on board.
No, no, I really appreciate it, and I really support this. I think it's a fantastic effort. Hopefully, the listeners will just keep on building and building, and it'll be a real asset for you and ideally Loop Horizon as well. So, congratulations and well done.
Thank you, James. And for the listeners who've made it this far, thank you so much and keep on analyzing.